Narrative poetry, you say? Isn't that like ordering jumbo shrimp or wanting to wear shoes for gloves? If you want to write a narrative poem, why not just say you have a stargazing appointment at noon?
Good grief, are you for real?
Well, not really, but kind of. Narrative poetry is an interesting study in blended priorities. Take, for example, the kinds of things that guides on writing stories usually include, stuff like character, plot, setting, and dialogue, and compare it to the things that guides on poetry usually focus on. Imagery, sound, repetition, emotion. And doing that, you could get the idea that there's a sizable gap between the world of narrative and the world of poetry. And yet, there you have narrative poetry doing its best to be both.
I'll save people for making the comments. Poems can tell stories.
Well, sure they can, but narrative is not essential to poetry the way it is to, say, writing fiction. A novel without a plot or characters, that's a problem. But a poem without a plot or characters, that's business as usual. So I guess what I mean is that narrative or storytelling is central to the identity of fiction in a way that it just isn't for poetry. Instead, poetry tends to be governed by lyricism, and maybe a little unexpectedly, I really like how the sociologist Andrew Abbott differentiates the two.
Oh, that's just because you like his name.
And so what if it is? But here's what he says. A narrative writer seeks to tell us what happened and perhaps to explain it. A lyrical writer aims to tell us of his or her intense reaction to some portion of the social process seen in a moment. This means that the first will tell us about sequences of events, while the second will give us congeries of images. It means that the first will try to show reality by abstract mimesis, while the second will try to make us feel reality through concrete emotions.
Really? Academic theory this early in the video, and from a sociologist, no less?
Oh, that's like our whole thing, isn't it, bud?
Whoa, don't lump me in with this. You're digging this hole so you can dig out.
Okay, maybe I will. For Abbott, narrative involves telling a story, explaining a sequence of events and simulating, as it were, the development of those events over time. So you can read a novel or watch a movie about made-up characters who band together to fight evil and become great friends in the process. Lyric, however, isn't really interested in the larger sequence. It's more interested in evoking real emotions in response to concrete moments, like a sense of awe at a bird of prey, a quiet appreciation for a wheelbarrow, a deep sorrow for the death of a hedgehog. In Abbott's words, to see a moment as complete in itself yet absolutely transitory is thus the foundation of the lyric sensibility. And with lyric's close association to poetry, it's a short jump to friend of the show Kenneth Burke's notion of poetic meaning, which would try to derive its vision from the maximum heaping up of all these emotional factors, playing them off against one another, inviting them to reinforce and contradict one another, and seeking to make this active participation itself a major ingredient of the vision. Short version, poetry in the lyric mode focuses on individual moments and uses those moments to draw out emotional significance. Stories in the narrative mode are more interested in dramatizing sequences of events and motivated actions. To me, it's like the difference between watching a movie and looking at a photograph. But narrative poetry is where we get into the blurry boundaries, which, speaking of blurry boundaries, we've got a special guest sitting just outside of frame in the room with us now, actually present. And as much as I like to float in the vapid, vaporous voids of theory, Jonah from Roughest Drafts actually likes to write narrative poems. So if it's all right with you, bud, maybe we'll hand it off to Jonah for some practical insights into writing narrative poetry.
All right. All I ever want is a break from your voice. Please, do it sooner.
Well then, my own tendencies lean towards lyricism, so tell us, why write narrative poetry? What does it do that other genres just can't?
Lately I've been reading these two anthologies, Flash Fiction America and Models of the Universe, an anthology of the prose poem. And note, not every prose poem is a narrative one, but there are plenty in this collection. Sometimes there isn't much that differentiates a prose poem from a piece of flash. However, one of the major differences I've noticed is poetry's ability to reflect on its own narrative. I've often said that all poetry is sort of self-referential. All poems, even prose poems, are drawing attention to their own form. That, in my opinion, gives a different opportunity for a writer and reader to ponder a story and its telling, as opposed to a flash fiction or flash essay. But with that said, I think all pieces of literature find their form in the process of writing. Sometimes I set out to write a narrative poem only to realize the piece is demanding to be a prose piece.
Interesting. So it kind of sounds to me like narrative poetry takes a scrap of narrative as an occasion for a more lyrical reflection, right? The unique advantage of the narrative poem versus conventional narrative is that narrative poetry has that inclination to reflect on itself. It actually makes me think of, if I may quote Ted Kooser for the 8 trillionth time, the idea that many poems begin with anecdotes. You might experience something and then start writing a poem about it, but an anecdote by itself is not, and maybe cannot be, a poem. Kooser says in order to make an anecdote a poem, you have to put pressure on it. So maybe it's helpful to think of a narrative poem as a poem first, which employs some narrative elements, rather than as a story that has the trappings of poetry. So if that's the basic idea, what is it that's different about actually writing narrative poetry? Where could we start?
As mentioned previously, while poets might have a lot more freedom and unconventionality in their narratives, writers still have to be careful. One professor in my program, David Wojan, doesn't ask himself if a poem is done, he asks himself if it's worthy. That's obviously kind of nebulous, but so is the idea of done, if you ask me. When writing a narrative poem, a poet has to ask if the narrative is worthy. Is it a story worth telling, and has it been told in the best way possible via the poem? As Brett Lott once told me, we are servants to our stories. We write because the story needs to be heard, and in order to make it heard, we give it the best form possible.
Cool. So maybe it's helpful to look at this in practice. Let's imagine that I've started with an anecdote that I think is worthy of telling. Maybe something like this. One day, my grandfather took me fishing in his little blue rowboat. We launched into the great unknown of the little lake by his house, trailing our line in the boat's wake while my grandfather rowed us from one spot in the murky water to the next. We didn't catch any fish, but I do remember stopping for lunch on the open water and the cookies that my grandmother had packed for us. As the trip came to its close, my grandfather let me row home, and I felt like quite the adventurer. It's kind of a cute little narrative, I guess.
Speak for yourself.
But it's also clearly just an anecdote. Now, you might fool a reader into thinking it's a poem at first glance by breaking it into lines, but I'd hasten to point out that it's not the lines that make it a poem. Just do that and you're going to have grouches in the comments complaining about how all modern poetry is just broken prose. And they're actually just wrong, but we don't need to fuel their distrust of free verse, do we? Besides, like Jonah said, a narrative prose poem is totally possible, so we ought to step back and think about some of these key points. If we are, per Kooser, going to put some pressure on this anecdote, what would you recommend that we do?
Even though narrative poems are allowed to skip steps in a way that narrative fiction or nonfiction can't, I do think it's important to maintain a narrative through line. Lyric poems have through lines too, but obviously not in a storytelling sense. Plus, I think a lyric piece is allowed to stray more freely. The poet can jump from one thought to another with little constraint, whereas the narrative poet still has to take stock of their story and its logistics. It's okay to interrupt the story, by all means, but the through line still has to make it, in some way, from beginning to end. As for what remains consistent, this isn't always the case, but language. In fiction, it's very important that the language doesn't get in the way of the storytelling. The last thing you want is to take the reader out. However, as Samuel Taylor Coleridge said, while prose is words in the best order, poetry is the best words in the best order. Even in a narrative poem, the poet should be paying very close attention to their language, and to its sound and musicality.
Great! Form and language are prime suspects for putting pressure on an anecdote and elevating it towards the expectations that we usually place on poetry. As written, my anecdote, even when it's broken into lines, is just kind of slack. It's sort of just summarizing what happened. It is, in the barest sense, just a narrative. So tightening the language would certainly help. Being more deliberate with form could too. But I want to go back to where we started and also point out that we're writing a narrative poem and not a poetic narrative. So even if that's kind of an irritating distinction, I'd argue that the goal is not just to dress up a story with some poetic language, but to recenter on the rhetorical differences between narrative and lyric. Just saying what happened, even in pretty words, probably isn't enough to put pressure on the anecdote. So, to put a lyrical foundation under our narrative poem, will probably want to concentrate the experience and amplify the emotional arc of the piece as it accompanies that narrative progression. I actually posted some iterative drafts of this poem on Substack a while back, but here's a version of this piece that retains its narrative gesture while also putting plenty of healthy poetic pressure on itself. Gone fishing. I stood on the shore, 6 years tall and smelling like sunscreen, while my grandfather strapped me into a life jacket. The day had come, and who knows how long I had asked and asked while casting from the sand, reeling in broken sticks and algal clumps. But yes, the day had come to step onto the wobbly blue rowboat and venture out to where the fish really were. So I scanned the starboard murk for flicker or ripple while he rowed, watched for phantoms in the lakeweed while he tied new lures to my line. When we paused to eat, my hook, beaded with luminous pink salmon eggs, bobbed unbothered beneath the breeze-rippled surface. But I was caught up in my grandmother's cookies, pale, almond-scented, studded with candy pink chips. But it turns out the fish weren't out there either, so he let me row us home. I heaved my grade school strength against the weight of the lake, fueled by his trust, by my duty as the world's newest mariner. And our lines slack in our wake, the oars, bleached and worn, arced high, showering drops of afternoon sun into the deep. Yes, this piece does tell a story. It has a strong narrative through line, but it's also undeniably a poem rather than just an anecdote. And if you're asking me, it's because it's not just telling a story, it's putting pressure on it, leveraging the sounds of language, the evocative energy of concrete images, and of course the unmistakably poetic tension between line and sentence. But maybe most importantly, it's still doing the thoroughly lyrical work of reflecting on the emotional significance of the experiences that accumulate through the telling of the story. In other words, it's telling a story to make a lyrical point, rather than using some poetic tools to dress up a story. And that, I think, is what makes it a narrative poem. That's me, though, and I'll make no secret of the fact that on the narrative lyrical spectrum, I'm most comfortable sitting deep in lyric territory. In fact, we did a video over on Roughest Drafts where we discussed the relative lyric versus narrativeness of various poems. So if you're looking for a deeper demonstration of the nuances of both, be sure to head over there next. But Jonah, since you're the more practiced narrative poet, do you have any other advice for those of us who want to give it a go? Anything we should be on the lookout for?
My advice to people who want to write narrative poetry would probably be the same as my advice to people who want to write poetry in all its forms. If you want to write narrative poems, you have to read a lot of narrative poems, and you have to write a lot of narrative poems. But on top of that, when it comes to narrative poetry specifically, I would challenge poets to think about what a story really is and what it can be. Given all the freedom you have in poetry, and given that we are servants to our stories, consider, how is the story being told? With rhyme, with meter, in free verse, in hermit crab form, with particular emphasis on the images, with total interiority, with no interiority. As with all poems, there are so many avenues to explore beyond what we may have been told about stories in school.
Whenever someone asks me a question about writing, I feel caught in the reality that the correct answer is almost always the not so helpful, it depends. And it's true with poetry in all its forms, and especially true with poetry that cozies up to the borders of other genres. I'd be willing to argue that even the most narrative poetry is still, at its rhetorical heart, pretty lyrical, especially compared to your typical narrative fiction. But as Howard Nemerov famously said about the boundaries between poetry and prose, the split between narrative and lyrical poetry is about as definite as determining the precise moment that a rainstorm becomes a snowstorm. Reasonable minds can and will draw different conclusions, so I guess the takeaway is write whatever you want, however you want to write it. But like Jonah pointed out, keep your audience in mind and make sure it's clear to them why your poem or story or something in between is really worth reading. Anything else from you?
And before I go, let me just touch on the idea of focus. When you watch a standard movie, you expect the main characters and the objects they interact with to always be in focus. However, in a non-traditional narrative, or in a poem, the focus can shift a lot more while still being about the main characters. In the visual medium, we might compare it to a movie like Playtime. As Dunkey says, this is a movie that puts the viewer to work. You are the spectator, but in a funny way, it's okay if you don't catch everything. You can still step on the scattered stones without having to touch all of them, and you can make it to the end. And all of that to say, forgive me if I ever lost focus, and thank you so much for letting me be a part of this, Andrew, despite my ramblings.
That's cute. Apologizing to you for rambling.
And what do you mean by that?
Oh, yeah, it's a little like apologizing to a raccoon for tipping over a garbage can. If we wanted to be honest, we could call the show Rambling with Andrew. Our guest has nothing to worry about.
And there, my friends, is another example of two reasonable minds drawing different conclusions, I guess. So I suppose we'll end it here. Don't forget to check out the video we did over on Jonah's channel. If you're coming from there, thanks for sticking around to the end. Either way, take good care and be sure to come back in a week for the next exciting installment in our Poetry Month festivities.